Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really pivotal, maybe even chaotic, period in American history.
That's right. We're looking at the years right after the Revolutionary War, from 1783 up to 1789.
Often called the critical period, and it really does feel critical when you look at the challenges.
Absolutely. We've got some fascinating sources that really shed light on just how uncertain everything was. We'll be touching on how the states first tried to govern themselves, the really tough economic situation.
Yeah, that sounds grim.
It was. And foreign policy headaches, the Articles of Confederation, what worked, what definitely didn't, Shays' Rebellion.
A major flashpoint.
Huge. And then, of course, the Constitutional Convention, all the arguments, the compromises that eventually led to the Constitution we have now.
So our mission here is to dig into those challenges, the big decisions made, and figure out what this whole turbulent era tells us about, well, the foundations of American government. Where should we start?
I think the states make the most sense. Back in 1776, even while the war was ongoing, the Continental Congress basically said, okay, colonies, you need to become states and write your own constitutions.
Based on Republican ideas, popular sovereignty, government by the people.
Exactly. That was the goal. The first real stab at self-government on a large scale.
And looking at these early state constitutions, they seem to have some common threads, almost like a reaction against British rule.
Very much so. You see bills of rights popping up everywhere, a real focus on protecting individual liberties from the government.
Makes sense.
And things like annual elections, keeping politicians on a short leash, accountable to the voters. But interestingly, they deliberately made the governors and the courts, well, weak.
Weak executives and judiciaries. Why was that?
Deep distrust of centralized power, really. They saw the legislature, the body elected frequently by the people, as the safest place for power. It was seen as the purest expression of the people's will.
So the legislatures were really running the show in those early state governments.
Pretty much. They were dominant. And another key thing, these new constitutions often gave more representation, more of a voice, to the western parts of the states.
Or poorer districts.
Yeah, areas that felt ignored by the coastal elites before the war. So, a subtle but important shift in power within the states themselves.
Okay, so states are figuring things out, but you mentioned the economy. Nationally, things weren't looking so good, were they?
No, not at all. The 1780s were hit by a major economic depression. You've got huge war debts, both national and state level.
Money owed everywhere.
Right. Plus, lots of people had borrowed heavily, often from British merchants, right after the war. Then there's the lack of stable currency. Farmers are struggling, sometimes violently demanding relief from debts and foreclosures.
And inflation.
Runaway inflation in some places. And on top of all that, cheap British goods start flooding the market, undercutting American businesses that were just trying to get started.
Wow, a perfect storm almost.
It really was. A tough time to launch a new nation economically.
I see here the sources mentioned seizing loyalist property. Did that help the economy at all?
Well, it had an effect. Taking those large estates owned by loyalists and breaking them up into smaller farms did spread land ownership a bit wider.
So more people owning land?
Yeah, it boosted what you might call economic democracy, and it helped a new class of people, maybe profiteers in some cases, gain wealth. It's interesting. This economic democracy, driven by available land, seemed to happen before full political democracy really took hold.
That's a fascinating point. Land access, driving opportunity. What about manufacturing? Didn't the boycotts before the war give it a little boost?
They did, temporarily. The non-importation agreements forced Americans to make more things themselves. But after independence, they lost guaranteed access to markets within the British Empire. Those navigation laws really hurt.
So closed doors there.
Yeah, but American merchants were resourceful. They started finding new outlets, trading in the Baltic Sea, even reaching Asia. So some new opportunities opened up, but losing the British market was still a blow.
Okay, so a really challenging economic scene. Let's shift to foreign policy. You mentioned headaches, and it sounds like Britain was a big one.
Oh, definitely. Britain wasn't exactly welcoming the U.S. to the world stage. They refused a commercial treaty, kept their restrictive navigation laws in place.
Hurting American trade?
Severely. And, maybe more worryingly, they kept troops stationed on forts out on the American frontier, on U.S. soil.
Why were they doing that?
Well, the thinking is they wanted to maintain ties with Native American tribes, maybe use them as a buffer against American expansion towards Canada, and definitely keep control of the fur trade.
And there were accusations they were stirring up trouble.
Yeah, supplying tribes, maybe even encouraging raids on American settlements. It was a real thorn in the side of the new government, undermining its sovereignty.
Did the British have complaints about the U.S. side?
They did. They pointed to the peace treaty, saying Americans weren't paying back debts owed to British merchants and weren't treating the loyalists who stayed fairly.
And could the U.S. government do anything about these British actions or complaints?
That was the core problem. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress just didn't have the power to force the states to comply with treaties or to create a unified trade policy, like imposing tariffs nationwide.
So they couldn't retaliate effectively against Britain's trade rules.
Exactly. Each state did its own thing, which made the U.S. look weak and divided. It really hampered any kind of effective negotiation.
Man, stuck between a rock and a hard place. What about Spain? Sounds like they were also causing major problems, especially with the Mississippi River.
Spain was a huge challenge, particularly for westward expansion. In 1784, they just closed the mouth of the Mississippi River to American shipping.
Which was vital for settlers in
Tennessee and Kentucky, absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
That was their main route to get crops and goods to market through New Orleans. Closing it was devastating economically for them.
And Spain claimed territory the U.S. thought was theirs?
Yep. A big chunk of land north of the Gulf of Mexico, including Florida, which Britain had actually ceded to the U.S., plus they were cozying up to Native American tribes in the southeast.
Trying to block U.S. expansion there, too.
Right. Trying to hem in Georgia and South Carolina, supplying tribes like the Creek, making Georgia really vulnerable. Basically, Spain was trying to keep the U.S. confined east of the Appalachians. They effectively challenged U.S. control over almost half the territory it claimed.
Sounds like a deliberate containment strategy.
It absolutely was. They even got involved in plots trying to lure western regions away from the U.S. There was this whole scheme with an American officer, James Wilkinson.
Wilkinson, what was that about?
He was basically trying to get Kentucky to secede from the U.S. and maybe align with Spain in exchange for trading privileges down the Mississippi.
Wow, did it go anywhere?
It fizzled out when Spain eventually reopened the river in 1788. But it shows you just how fragile American control was out west and how tempting foreign alliances could be for disgruntled settlers.
And this proposed Jay-Gardoki Treaty caused a massive uproar, didn't it? Trading Mississippi rights for trade elsewhere.
Huge uproar. The idea was John Jay negotiating with Spain's envoy, Gardoki. Northeastern merchants would get trading rights with Spain, which they really wanted.
Okay, sounds good for them.
But the price was the U.S. giving up free navigation rights on the Mississippi for like 25 or 30 years.
No, the South and West would have hated that.
Hated it. They saw it as the Northeast selling out their future for its own gain. Some Easterners actually liked the idea of slowing down westward migration, fearing it would drain their population and power.
So it really exposed deep regional divides.
Absolutely. It almost tore the country apart. People started talking about secession, separate confederacies. For others, though, it was a wake-up call. We need a stronger national government that can actually look out for everyone's interests and handle foreign policy effectively. The fact that the treaty failed really highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles.
Even our ally France wasn't making things easy.
No free rides there. France wanted its war loans repaid, adding more financial pressure. And they put restrictions on American trade with their colonies in the West Indies, which were valuable markets.
Man, it feels like the U.S. was friendless and broke on the world stage. And then Barbary pirates. Serious.
Oh, yeah. Very serious. Pirates from North African states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Morocco, were attacking American merchant ships in the Mediterranean.
What happened to the sailors?
Captured, enslaved, held for ransom. The Day of Algiers was known for being particularly brutal. Before independence, British ships had some protection because Britain paid tribute.
But the U.S. couldn't afford that.
Couldn't afford the tribute and didn't have a navy strong enough to protect its own ships. It was humiliating, costly, and another stark reminder of the national government's weakness. This vulnerability, this inability to protect its own citizens and commerce abroad, must have really pushed people towards wanting a stronger federal government.
You can definitely see why. All these external pressures, economic chaos, it leads right into questioning the government itself. Let's talk about America's first attempt, the Articles of Confederation. It's safe to say it wasn't a roaring success.
That's putting it mildly. Remember, the Second Continental Congress that ran things during the war wasn't really a constitutional government.
No.
It did foreign policy, ran the army, but the states saw themselves as sovereign.
And getting the Articles ratified took ages, right?
Yeah.
Disputes over Western lands.
Exactly. Adopted by Congress in 1777, but not fully ratified by all states until 1781. The big holdup was Western land claims. 7 states claimed vast territories out west based on old colonial charters.
Like New York and Virginia.
Right. And the 6 states without those claims, like Maryland and Pennsylvania, felt that wasn't fair. They argued those lands were won by everyone together in the war and should belong to the national government.
So Maryland held out.
Maryland dug in its heels until New York and Virginia agreed to cede their claims to Congress. Congress then promised to eventually carve new, equal states out of that territory. That finally got the Articles over the line.
Okay, so 1781, they're finally official. What did this first government actually look like?
It was basically a League of Friendship, a loose alliance of 13 independent states. The central government was just a Congress, no president, no national court system.
Again, reacting against the British model.
Definitely. Fear of strong central power was paramount. And in Congress, every state got just one vote, no matter how big or small.
Giving tiny Rhode Island the same power as Virginia.
Exactly. Passing laws required 9 out of 13 states to agree.
Yeah.
And amending the Articles. That needed unanimous agreement from all 13.
Unanimous. That sounds impossible.
It pretty much was. It made the government incredibly difficult to adapt or strengthen. It was almost designed for weakness.
You can say that again. What were the biggest weaknesses in practice?
Well, it was intentionally weak, keeping power with the states. 2 huge problems stood out. First, Congress couldn't regulate trade between the states.
Leading to states putting tariffs on each other's goods.
Yeah, trade wars between states, different regulations. It was chaotic and bad for the economy. Second, Congress couldn't directly tax anyone. It could only ask the states for money.
And the states didn't always pay up, I imagine.
Often they didn't, or paid late, or only partially. The government couldn't force them. It couldn't act directly on citizens, only on the state governments themselves. This made it powerless to enforce its own laws or raise steady revenue.
And this led to some pretty scary moments, like the Newburgh Conspiracy.
Right. In 1783, some unpaid army officers were seriously talking about using the military to force the states to give Congress more power, especially the power to tax so they could get paid.
Wow. How was that stopped?
George Washington stepped in. His leadership and appeal to their patriotism basically diffused the situation, but it showed how desperate things were.
And then Congress itself got chased out of Philadelphia.
Also, in 1783, unpaid Pennsylvania soldiers marched on Congress demanding their back pay. The Pennsylvania state government wouldn't or couldn't protect Congress, so the delegates had to literally flee the city and set up shop in Princeton, New Jersey for a while.
How embarrassing for the national government.
Deeply embarrassing. It just underscored how little power and respect the central government had. It couldn't even guarantee its own safety.
Yet, despite all these massive problems, the Articles government did manage one significant achievement, didn't it? The land ordinances.
That's the big exception, yes. Amidst all the failures, they passed 2 incredibly important laws about the Western territories. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was first.
What did that do?
It set up a system for surveying and selling the land in the Old Northwest. That's future Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. The idea was to sell the land to pay off the national debt.
How did they organize it?
Into a grid system. Townships, 6 miles square, divided into 36 sections of 1 square mile each. And crucially, 1 section in every township was reserved to fund public schools.
That's pretty forward-thinking. And different from how things were settled further south.
Yeah, south of the Ohio River, settlement was often more haphazard, leading to lots of conflicting land claims. This ordinance aimed for order.
And then came the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
Even more significant, arguably. This laid out the process for how these territories could become states. They'd start under federal control, but once they had 60,000 people, they could apply for statehood on equal footing with the original 13.
That promise of equality was key, wasn't it, for keeping East and West together?
Absolutely vital. It prevented the creation of permanent colonies and ensured the country could expand peacefully. Its principles were used for all later territories, too. And maybe most importantly,
It banned slavery in those territories.
yes, explicitly prohibited slavery north of the Ohio River. A huge decision with massive long-term consequences, clearly favoring the North's development path, though it did include a clause about returning fugitive slaves.
So, real vision there regarding westward expansion, but back east, the Articles were just falling apart.
Pretty much. The request system for money from the states totally failed. Debt was piling up. States were fighting over borders, slapping tariffs on each other, printing their own worthless paper money. Chaos.
Which brings us to Shays' Rebellion, a breaking point.
It felt like it to many people. This was 1786, Western Massachusetts. Farmers, Many of them Revolutionary War veterans were losing their farms to foreclosure, getting thrown in debtor's prison.
What were their demands?
They wanted the state to issue paper money to make debts easier to pay, lower taxes, and stop the foreclosures. Led by Daniel Shays, another veteran, they took up arms.
What did they do?
They shut down courthouses to stop the foreclosure proceedings. They even marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield, hoping to seize weapons.
Was the national government able to stop them?
No, Congress was powerless. The Massachusetts state government had to raise a private militia funded by wealthy Boston merchants to put down the rebellion.
What was the impact of Shays' rebellion?
It terrified the property classes across the country. They saw it as mob rule, anarchy breaking out. It dramatically highlighted the weakness of the Articles and fueled the argument that a much stronger national government was needed to maintain order and protect property. It wasn't the first Western uprising, but its timing was crucial.
So it directly led to calls for change.
Directly. It really strengthened the hand of those pushing for reform, which led to the Annapolis Convention.
Right, Annapolis in 1786. What was the goal there?
Officially, it was just to talk about problems with interstate commerce. Pretty limited scope.
Did many states show up?
Nope. Only 5 states sent delegates. It looked like a failure.
But Alexander Hamilton was there.
He was. And Hamilton, ever the nationalist, saw an opportunity. He managed to convince the few delegates there to issue a call for another convention in Philadelphia the next year.
And this one wouldn't just tinker with trade rules.
Exactly. This one would have a broader mandate to revise the Articles of Confederation to make the federal government strong enough to actually govern effectively.
Which brings us right to the threshold of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787, a landmark event.
Truly. May 25th, 1787. Delegates start gathering. Every state eventually sends someone except
Rhode Island, always the outlier.
Rhode Island sits it out. The delegates were mostly appointed by state legislatures, generally men of property, lawyers, merchants, planters. Pretty elite group.
About 55 delegates in total.
That's right. Jefferson, who was in Paris, called them an assembly of demigods. Though some key figures, strong states' rights guys like Patrick Henry, refused to go, they smelled a rat, feared too much national power.
But you had Washington, Franklin, Hamilton, and James Madison.
Key players. Washington's presence lent immense credibility. He was unanimously chosen to preside. Franklin brought wisdom. Hamilton pushed for a very strong government. And Madison came prepared.
He's often called the father of the Constitution.
Fair title.
He certainly played a crucial, perhaps the most crucial role. He had thought deeply about government structure and arrived with a plan, the Virginia Plan.
What were his core ideas? Several big ones. First, the idea that the national government's power should come from the people, not the states, and it should be stronger than the states in its sphere. Second, separation of powers, distinct legislative, executive, judicial branches checking each other. He saw how powerful state legislatures had become and wanted to avoid that at the national level.
And the idea of a large republic being a good thing.
Yes, that was radical. The common wisdom, based on Montesquieu, was that republics only worked in small territories. Madison argued the opposite in what became Federalist No. 10, that a large republic with diverse interests would actually prevent any single faction from dominating. Brilliant stuff. But calling him the sole father maybe downplays the intense debates and compromises involving everyone else.
And one of the first huge decisions was to just scrap the Articles entirely, even though they were only supposed to revise them.
That was a bold move. They basically decided the Articles were beyond repair and started fresh. Technically, they exceeded their mandate. It was, in a way, a peaceful overthrow of the existing government structure.
Which must have been controversial.
Hugely. It immediately raised fears about losing state power. And the biggest fight right out of the gate was over representation. How would states be represented in the new Congress?
This is where the Virginia Plan and New Jersey Plan clash.
Exactly. The Virginia Plan, Madison's baby, favored the big states. It proposed 2 houses of Congress, and in both houses, representation would be based on population.
So, more people, more votes. Virginia liked that.
Naturally. But the small states like New Jersey, Delaware, they were horrified. They proposed the New Jersey Plan, 1 house of Congress, and every state gets an equal vote, just like under the Articles.
They feared being totally dominated by the big states.
Completely swamped. They felt their voices, their very existence as equal states, would be lost if everything was based on population. It was an existential issue for them.
How did they break this deadlock? It sounds like a potential deal breaker.
It almost was. The solution came in the form of the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth were key figures here.
What did it propose?
A 2-house Congress, a bicameral legislature. One house, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population. That satisfied the large states.
And tax bills would start there too, right?
Yes, reflecting the larger populations and tax base.
Mm.
But the other house, the Senate, would have equal representation. 2 senators for every state, regardless of size.
Ah, so that protected the small states' influence.
Exactly. It gave them a crucial check in the legislative process. It was a compromise, though many argue the larger states still got the better end of the overall deal.
Okay, representation settled. Another big change was creating a real executive branch, a president. Very different from the weak governors under the Articles.
A major shift. They wanted an executive with energy, capable of acting decisively. The president was made commander-in-chief, given power to appoint officials and judges, and a veto over legislation passed by Congress.
How was the president elected? Not directly by the people.
No. They created the Electoral College. It was an indirect system. Each state would choose electors. How they chose them was up to the state. And those electors would vote for the president. It was a compromise reflecting distrust of pure popular democracy and trying to balance state and popular influence.
Now, we can't talk about the convention without talking about slavery, a huge source of conflict between North and South.
The elephant in the room, absolutely. It hung over everything and forced some deeply uncomfortable compromises.
Like the 3/5 compromise. How did that work?
This is about counting population for both representation in the House and for direct taxation purposes. Southern states wanted to count their enslaved population fully to boost their representation.
But northern states objected, saying slaves weren't citizens and shouldn't be counted for representation.
Right, or argued if they're counted for representation, they should be counted for taxation too. The compromise was to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person for both purposes.
A chilling calculation.
Deeply disturbing. It gave the South extra political power based on people they held in bondage. Many delegates, North and South, probably hoped or believed slavery would eventually die out, but this compromise baked its political influence into the system's foundation.
What about the slave trade itself? And fugitive slaves?
More compromises. Most states wanted to ban the importation of slaves immediately, but South Carolina and Georgia threatened to walk out. They claimed they needed slave labor for their rice fields.
So another compromise.
Yes. Congress was forbidden from banning the African slave trade until 1808, a 20-year delay. And the Constitution included a fugitive slave clause requiring escaped slaves to be returned to their owners, even if they reached a free state.
And the Commerce Compromise also touched on North-South issues.
It did. It allowed Congress to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, which the North wanted. But to appease the South, which relied on agricultural exports, Congress was forbidden from taxing exports. Only imports could be taxed.
It's incredible how these compromises shaped the nation. And ironic, too, you mentioned, the South expecting to grow and dominate, the North thinking slavery would fade. Both wrong.
Profoundly wrong.
Wow.
These compromises postponed the conflict, but ultimately couldn't resolve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the nation.
Let's talk structure. Checks and balances, separation of powers. Where did those ideas come from?
Largely from Enlightenment thinkers, especially the French philosopher Montesquieu and his book, The Spirit of the Laws.
The idea being 3 branches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Legislative, Congress makes laws. Executive, President enforces laws. And judicial, courts interpret laws. Each branch with distinct powers, but also with ways to check the power of the others.
Examples.
President can veto laws from Congress. Congress can impeach the president or judges. The courts, later established through judicial review, can declare laws unconstitutional. It's a system designed to prevent tyranny by any one branch.
And the elastic clause. That sounds important. What's that?
That's the necessary and proper clause in Article 1. It gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its listed powers.
So it gives Congress flexibility.
Immense flexibility. It was a compromise between those who wanted only strictly listed powers, states' rights folks, and those who wanted broader national authority, nationalists. It allows the government to adapt to new challenges not explicitly mentioned in the text. Hugely important over the long run.
And Congress explicitly got the power to regulate commerce, which it lacked before, and the supremacy clause.
Both massive changes from the Articles. Regulating interstate commerce was crucial for creating a national economy. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6 states that the Constitution and federal laws are the supreme law of the land.
Meaning federal law trumps state law if there's a conflict.
Precisely. It established the authority of the national government in a way the articles never could.
The sources mention conservative safeguards built in. What were they guarding against?
Fear of the mob, basically. Fear of too much democracy, of the uneducated masses making rash decisions. Remember Shays' rebellion.
So what were these safeguards?
Things like life tenure for federal judges, insulating them from popular pressure, the Electoral College for choosing the president, not direct popular vote, and originally senators were chosen by state legislatures, not directly elected by the people.
So only the House of Representatives was directly elected.
By the qualified voters, yes. And qualifications usually meant being a white male property owner. So while the government was based on we the people, there were definitely filters put in place. It makes you wonder if some felt it was a step back from the revolution's more radical democratic spirit.
Still, the foundation was popular consent, drawing on Locke and others.
Absolutely. The preamble, we the people, is revolutionary. It's not a contract between states, but a government established by the citizenry itself.
Yeah.
A delegation of power from the governed.
Okay, so the convention wraps up. No one's perfectly happy. Lots of compromises made. But
Yeah.
no Bill of Rights. That seems like a huge omission. Why?
It was. And it became a major sticking point during ratification. There were several reasons given. Some argued most states already had bills of rights. Others feared that listing specific rights might imply that any unlisted rights weren't protected.
Like, if you list freedom of speech, does that mean you don't have freedom to travel?
That kind of concern. Also, Southern delegates were wary how could they talk about universal rights while upholding slavery. And maybe most practically, they had just hammered out this incredibly complex, fragile compromise on the government structure. Bringing up a whole new set of contentious issues about rights might have blown the whole thing up.
Get the framework done first.
That seems to have been the calculation. Establish the government, then maybe add rights later if needed.
So the Constitution goes out to the states, and ratification wasn't easy. It needed 9 states, not all 13 like the articles required.
Right, a lower bar. They knew unanimity was probably impossible. Once 9 ratified, it would become law for those 9, effectively creating a new union. Congress just sent it out without recommending it, which itself caused a stir. People were shocked by the secrecy and the radical change.
And this is where Federalists and Anti-Federalists square off.
The great debate begins. Federalists supported the Constitution. Anti-Federalists opposed it, or at least demanded changes. Special state conventions were elected to vote on ratification.
Who ratified quickly?
The small states generally jumped on board fast. Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, they liked the equal representation they got in the Senate. Pennsylvania was the first big state, but there was strong opposition there.
Massachusetts was a key battle, wasn't it?
Absolutely critical. The Anti-Federalists initially had a majority in the Massachusetts Convention. Their main argument, no Bill of Rights.
So how did the Federalists win them over?
They made a crucial promise. Ratify now, and we'll push for amendments, adding a Bill of Rights, as soon as the new government is up and running. That tipped the balance. Barely. It passed 187 to 168.
Close call. Then Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire followed.
Yes, New Hampshire was the 9th state on June 21st, 1788. Technically, the Constitution was now in effect.
But you still needed the big players, Virginia and New York, and they weren't rushing to join.
Not at all. Their ratification was more out of necessity. Virginia was huge and influential, with strong anti-federalists led by Patrick Henry.
I smell a rat.
That was his sentiment. But Washington, Madison, John Marshall argued hard for the Federalist side. Plus, with 9 states already in, Virginia risks being left out. They ratified shortly after New Hampshire.
And New York. That debate produced the Federalist Papers, right?
Yes. New York had a tough fight. It was the only state that let all free adult males vote for convention delegates. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers' brilliant essays, published in newspapers arguing for the Constitution.
Including Madison's Federalist Number 10 about factions.
Which was incredibly influential in arguing a large republic could work. New York eventually ratified, also not wanting to be isolated. North Carolina and Rhode Island held out even longer.
Stubborn Rhode Island.
They only ratified after the new government was already operating. They hadn't even attended the convention. Very independent streak.
So looking back, ratification was a victory for the nationalists, but maybe not a landslide.
Definitely not a landslide in some key states. It was often the same political elites who were at the convention leading the charge for ratification. And arguably, it wouldn't have passed in places like Massachusetts or Virginia without the promise of a Bill of Rights.
It feels like a minority pushing through a major change.
You could argue that. Remember, only about a quarter of adult white men voted for the delegates to the state conventions. If everyone could have voted, maybe it wouldn't have passed. It was, in a sense, a conservative counter-revolution against the perceived excesses and weaknesses under the Articles.
Restoring stability, but maybe limiting some of the revolutionary democracy.
That's the tension. It aimed to restore economic and political order, using those safeguards we talked about. But it did so while preserving the core principle of government, based on popular consent, albeit filtered through checks and balances designed to reconcile liberty with order.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, ground tracing this really intense critical period. From the shaky Articles of Confederation, through all the crises and debates, to finally forging the Constitution, the compromises, the arguments over power. It's clear how foundational this time was.
It really is. And what's striking is how the decisions made then, especially those compromises over representation and, crucially, over slavery, even if they thought slavery was temporary, how those echoes are still shaping our society and our political arguments today.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Think about this. What parts of this critical period, these foundational debates and compromises, do you still see being argued about or unpacked in America today? How do those choices made over 2 centuries ago continue to cast a shadow or provide a framework for our present challenges? Something to chew on. We hope this deep dive gave you a better feel for just how much went into creating the American system of government. Thanks for joining us.